and welcome to Community Issues, a Tapestry of Concerns. My name is Alyce Smith-Cooper. I'm your host. And for those of you who know me, you know that when you see this hat, that a story is coming. I haven't had a chance to do a story for you for a long time, and I'm studying a period in history that is fascinating to me, and I wanted to share some of it with you. And it's the time in the lives of African people who were stolen and sold and brought to this part of the world and called slaves and treated as chattel slaves. This period of time that I'm talking about, there was and as there's always a great yearning for freedom. No one wants to be burdened down and shackled and not able to have dominion over their own lives. And so the Underground Railroad, that term has just fascinated me. And so I began studying, began musing about it and thinking about the people that had this experience of yearning for freedom and literally taking their lives and their destinies in their own hands by running away from the people who had bought them and running toward freedom. And this whole idea of the Underground Railroad was fascinating to me. When I first heard it, I thought, well, are you talking about subways? I mean, there were no subways in those days. We're talking about the 1800s. Actually, this behavior of people running toward freedom started in the 1500s when the Spaniards brought Africans to these lands and enslaved them. So the Underground Railroad is not just an 1800s experience, but it became much more active during the 1830s to 1850s period. It wasn't a railroad and it wasn't underground. It was a network of people who provided safe places for people who were on the run for their lives and for their freedom to be fed and helped and nurtured and moved along on their journey. And so as I began reading about it and thinking about it, the stories that the people had to tell began to just kind of boil up in my spirit. And of course we know about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman had been a slave in Maryland, and she found her way to freedom, but she wasn't satisfied with her own freedom only. She went back many, many times, risking her life and certainly her freedom to help at least 300 other people to find their way out of slavery and to freedom. But as I began reading some of the stories, the characters began to come alive for me. And they began to take voices. And there was this one voice that came that I'd like to share with you this evening. I'll just talk like she talked. My name is Miriam Lightfoot. They call me Lightfoot because I could walk in those days so lightly that you couldn't hear me, even if I walked on dry leaves. Well, the name was given to me by my mother. She had been a runaway slave. But when she got out into the forest, into the swamplands, she broke her leg. And they left her there. They couldn't take her with them. And they couldn't wait till she healed, so they left her there. But my daddy found her. My daddy was a full-blooded Muskogee Indian. And he found my mother. He said she was the most pitiful thing he had ever seen, but also the most beautiful. And he took her back to the Muskogee Indian lands, nursed her back to health. And they lived a long time together. Yes, they did. I've got lots of sisters and brothers. I used to go hunting with my daddy. That's how I knew all these lands like the back of my hand. We would walk for miles and miles and miles. We went over mountains and down in valleys and across rivers. We knew these lands like the back of our hand. That's why it was so easy for me, especially walking real light like I do, or like I did in them days. It was easy for me to help some of those runaway slaves. Now, it wasn't an easy job, and it didn't pay nothing. I wouldn't have took no pay for it anyway. I didn't need any money. I had everything I needed. I knew how to hunt for what I wanted, and we made our housing, and we didn't need anything, so we wasn't looking for money. We was looking for the right thing to be done. Because my mother used to tell me what it was like to be a slave. And she didn't want nobody to be a slave, and she taught me the same thing. So that's why I would go to those places that they call plantations, where you couldn't always get close. Sometimes you had to stay a far piece away. But the way that you let folks know you was there was you would sing certain songs or make certain bird calls. There was a song that they used to sing all the time. It was about a chariot. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. That was one of the signals to let folks know to get ready, because the Underground Railroad was getting ready to run. And then there was certain other signs that they had, like sometimes they would hang quilts out. Certain quilts with certain symbols on them would let you know who was hiding in that house, and whether or not there was a bunch of them, or whether it was one or two, or whether they needed certain things or not. There was all kinds of signals and symbols that you could look around you, tell what was going on. But the thing that I just loved was whenever we got to some place that was safe, they called those the stations. And they called the people that were running, they called them the package. And of course they called the person that was going to get them and conducting them through, they called them the conductor. When we got someplace safe, like one of them stations, and we could get warm and get enough to eat, the stories that the people would tell. Like this one time, I remember this man, I have to tell you, he was a handsome man, a big strapping man, very easy to look at. And even for a runaway, his clothes was white dandy. He told stories about being a great chef, a great cook, not just anywhere. He told stories about being a chef in President Washington's house, the White House. Well, first in Mount Vernon, and then he said the president took him when the White House was in Philadelphia. Took him. And he cooked for everybody. Their heads of states and this one and that one. And then he said, the president didn't eat no leftovers. So he could take the food that was left and sell it. And he did it. And he said he made plenty of money, which was why he had decided that he was going to run for his life. Now, the one thing I couldn't understand, well, in a way I guess I could, because it was very hard out there, and women and children didn't make it too often. He said his wife had died, but he had 3 children that he left. He always looked real sad when he talked about them. But me being a woman, I couldn't quite understand it. But he called himself Hercules. I like the sound of that name, Hercules. Well, I tell you what, he made it. He made it. He made it to safety. And when the president left off, he freed him. So he was then a free man. Well, you see, the news got bad. Some of the stories that the people would tell. There was a child that got all of my admiration. She wasn't much more than probably about 12 or 13. But she had been separated from her mother when she was about 8, she thought. And it broke her heart. They took her and they put her out in the fields, and they liked to work the poor child to death. She said she thought she was going to die. In fact, she stopped eating, and that's why they took her into the big house and taught her how to sew. And as she was sewing the clothes and listening at the table when the people would come and talk about the different things that was going on, she would listen to what they were saying. And she would take the little scraps of fabric that were left over from the things she was sewing, and she made a quilt. That's what they called it. But it was really a map on how to get back to her mom and how to get to the folks on the Underground Railroad. Well, she worked on it for so long. She said it took her many months to scrap up the material and listening to what they said and making the patches that looked like the water that they was talking about, and the big old tree in the swamp that you had to go around, and all of the cornfields that you had to go through. And when the time she got finished with it, she had memorized it all. And so when she was getting ready to leave Anne, she didn't come by herself. Smart child. She had found her little sweetheart, Jack, his name was. And Jack wasn't much older than she was, but he loved her, and she loved him. And they took off on a stormy night. And they left that plantation. And from what that child remembered from that quilt that she said she made, she found her mama. And it was her mama and her little sister and Jack and her that was on the road together. Now, I told you it wasn't easy for women and children, especially not a little child, because they couldn't carry no food. So they was hungry most of the time. And it would get cold, bitter cold. But I'm going to tell you, that little girl, she encouraged everybody. She carried her little baby sister when she needed to. She dragged her mama if she had to. And then, one time I got tired. And she looked me square in the eye and said, Miss Lightfoot, they're depending on you. You can't get tired. And don't you know, I sat up straight and took me a deep breath and took me a chaw of tobacco. I used to chew tobacco in them days. And that child was right. I couldn't get tired. The stories, the people, their desire to be free in the face of everything that was going on around them. Because once they got on the road, then they had to worry about the paddy rollers. Those were the bounty hunters. They had a law that said that folks could go and capture runaway slaves. Even in the free states, they could go and get them. So they had to be careful about, even when they got to freedom, who they communicated with. And they had to always be on watch to make sure somebody wasn't going to snatch them and take them back into slavery. Because, oh, if they got took back, it was 10 times as bad as before they left. It was not a good thing. But what was the most exciting to me was to watch people get married once they made it to freedom. Because, you know, they weren't allowed to marry in slavery. Oh, they could jump over the broom. But they weren't allowed to say no vows and really be legal married. So when those folks would get up to the north or wherever they were going, I happened to see this in Detroit, Michigan myself. They would put on their finest clothes, whatever they had. And they would make these bow ties. The men would wear bow ties. And the women would wear a kerchief. And let me tell you, the jubilation, the pride, the joy that was felt. Well, you couldn't have been to one of them marriage ceremonies, and it would be a group marriage, you see. Whole lots of people would get married at the same time, because you couldn't get that many preachers for one thing. And they couldn't get together that often for another thing. So it was a big to-do, a big soiree. It just made you know how important it was for poor people especially, but people who hadn't had an opportunity to love each other in the ways that the community could respect. Of course they loved one another, but it was something to behold, one of those group weddings. Well, they didn't call me Miriam Lightfoot for nothing, because I could dance in those days. When the music struck up, I was on the floor, and I didn't stop till the music stopped. Those are wonderful memories. Wonderful memories. Even in hard times, there's wonderful memories. Even in hard times, there's joy to be had. And there's love to be shared. Slavery couldn't take it away. And neither can anything that you're experiencing today. There's something to be said for going back to the old ways of respecting those things that gave us rootedness. Respecting what gave us our strength to keep moving on. Well, let me tell you about that little child and her mother and Jack and her baby sister. Last I heard tell of them, they were headed up into Canada. Now, the last stretch of the Underground Railroad out of Detroit into Canada was through a church where they had dug a tunnel up underneath the river. And when you came out in Canada. I was so taken with that family that I went with them all the way. I went in that tunnel with them, and I came up on the other side. And let me tell you, there's a mighty good feeling to know when you've helped somebody gain their freedom. Now I know that you all are living in these days today. And you say there ain't no slavery no more. It was abolished December the 18th, 1865, something like that. But I submit to you, just for your consideration, that there's all different kinds of ways to be a slave. Because see, some of them people that was in slavery would tell you real quick, they stole me, they stole my labor, but they could never make a slave out of me here or here. But unfortunately today, what I see too often is people that have given away their minds, their hearts, and sometimes their soul. They would never acknowledge that they're a slave, but yet they truly are. Where's the Underground Railroad today? Where's the network of folk that will help you back to sanity? Help you back to respecting yourself and honoring your ancestors and the trials and tribulations that they went through? Where is the station where people honor the ability to vote? I see some of you out there ain't even registered in this historical time. Who, in my time, would have ever thought that we would see a black man running for president of this United States? Or a woman running for vice president? Who would have thought? And yet there's some of you who do not have the right to vote because you haven't registered. Where is the way station for you? And then there's some of you who can't vote because you've been to jail and you've got a felony, and yes, your right to vote has been taken, but let me tell you something. You can get it back if you want it back. You got to fight for it. There's ways and there's means if you have a desire. And then there's some of you who just don't think that getting married is important at all. And you live your lives just here and there and everywhere, with no rootedness, no groundedness to family or community. Where is the way station for you? I believe there is one. I just think you have to find it. Or maybe it'll find you. I don't know. They call me Miriam Lightfoot because I walk gently. And you can't hear me coming, and you won't hear me going. But I've seen a lot. And I've heard a lot. And I just want to leave you with a question. What part of the Underground Railroad are you? Because you see, there was a lot of different folks. It was all involved in making sure that people got freedom from all different walks of life, different nationalities, different economic status. They had a common goal to abolish slavery. What is our common goal today? But what do I know? I'm just a storyteller. Besides, I stepped on a nail, the nail bent, and that's the way the story went. And that is the way the story went. And Miriam Lightfoot came to tell you the story this evening. But you know me as Alyce Smith Cooper, and some of you know me as the ancestral storyteller. My hope is that the story this evening caught your attention, put a question in your mind, and perhaps some action in your life. The power of the story has no meaning whatsoever if there's not someone to hear it. And the real power of the story is when someone takes action because of what we heard. You have been a wonderful audience. You stayed through the whole story. I'm so pleased with you. And I know it was pretty much because of the hat. But that's okay. Whatever got you to listen to the story is fine with me. And you're probably thinking, is there a story behind that hat? Of course there's a story behind that hat. There is a story behind just about everything. Because really nothing happens until the story is told. But what do I know? I'm just a storyteller. And I stepped on the nail. Nail bit. That's the way the story the kalimba. Good night to all of you.